very strange. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out to Cornerstone Studios. Now, Cornerstone Studios is not down here. This is the church, Our Savior's Atonement. But Cornerstone Studios is on the 3rd floor of this building. We have 13 artists sharing space there. And the 13th of those 13 artists is our Studio178 Artist-in-Residence. And that's Dana, has been for the past 11 months. We've just selected a new Artist-in-Residence, and we'll be making an announcement about that soon. So we hope that you'll come back again next year for another artist's talk. Let me just tell you very briefly, Cornerstone Studios has been in existence since May of 2015. It's created to provide a reasonably priced workspace for artists in Washington Heights and Inwood. And we've been fully subscribed since we opened our doors. We've doubled in size since we opened our doors because we got a little more space upstairs, which is amazing. And we've had the Studio178 Artist-in-Residence program for 3 years and change because of COVID. So Dana was our 3rd. The next artist will be our 4th Artist-in-Residence. That space is subsidized by our organization and by the church jointly, so the price stays very, very reasonable at $178 a month, which is the address of this building. We thought that was kind of clever, so we did that. We've been happy to have Dana here. We're excited to hear more about her work. And at the end of our time here today, we'll take questions from the audience. Just think about what you'd like to ask. At the end, raise your hand, and Michael will come around with a camera and capture your question on film so that we can put together a beautiful movie of this event at the end of our time together. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions for me, I'll hang around at the end as well. Okay? Thanks so much. Turn it over to you, Dana.
Whoop. All right. Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction and also for organizing all of this. Also, I wanted to say thank you to Pastor John for opening up this space for us, not only for the residency upstairs, but also for this talk today. And lastly, thank all of you for coming out on this beautiful Saturday afternoon to hear about what I've been up to and what I've been working on in the past. I am Dana Hemes, and I'm an interspecies installation artist. So that means I typically work with living organisms. I've worked with ants and bacteria and pigeons, grass and moss and a few other things in the past. And I basically create environments where humans and these non-human organisms can share experiences together. So my goal is that the work kind of pushes against this human-centric thinking and instead maybe illuminates this interconnectedness between the world and humans and all of the things around us. All right. So this is just a quick, small bubble diagram that I often refer back to in my making. It's kind of just very loosely, it changes all the time, but it's also very loosely outlining kind of how I make. So that's sort of in the methods section, the ideas that underlie the making. So that's kind of in the modes of sensing area, and also what I'm making, which kind of ends up in the ways of meeting. So for example, I often use tools. They might be high-tech, they might be lo-fi or analog, but I use them to adapt spaces. So I'm looking for direct connections between humans and non-humans, and sometimes I'm pointing out ones that already exist. Sometimes I'm maybe revealing or making new ways of meeting, and the goal is to explore perhaps interspecies communication. So that said, I will start by showing you some previous work examples as kind of a basis, and then I'll show you what I've been working on here at Cornerstone. So Apis Homo 1 is a very simple analog piece that brings together humans and bees. So I just want to give you a quick side note about my naming conventions here, the titles of the work. It usually draws from the naming device from like the scientific classification. So Apis is the genus for bees, and Homo is the genus for humans, as in Homo sapiens. So you'll see that again and again, and I like that it kind of creates this dialogue of scientific conversation that's meeting the artwork in this case. So we already have such a complex relationship and interdependency with bees. We're really dependent on them, of course, for things like goods like honey, but also they pollinate all of our crops, or many of our crops that feed us. So that connection, it's like very essential to our day-to-day, but sometimes it's really easy to just go to the grocery store and buy your produce and totally forget that we ever need bees to do anything along the way. You know, kind of out of sight, out of mind. The relationship also isn't always healthy. So between climate change and pesticides, we've actually done a lot of damage to the bee populations. There are also circumstances where we actually truck hives of bees across the country in big trucks to like pollinate different orchards and crops. So it's a really kind of complex system that we've created for us and for them. So for this work, I wanted to kind of think about that relationship a little bit and to maybe connect back to my own personal like roots and connection to the humble bee. So I had a month-long residency up in Dorset, Vermont at the Marble House Project. It's a lovely place. I highly recommend it. They have this beautiful grounds. There's a quarry. It used to be a marble quarry. The house is made up of a lot of marble. It's beautiful. But they have all of these grounds. They have a big, beautiful garden. There are bees, there are chickens, and it's kind of this little ecosystem that the artists get to help maintain while we get to reap the benefits of the food that comes out of all of it. So I was thinking more about this connection, and I wanted to make work that directly spoke to that. So here in my studio space there, I created this bee human suit. So it was made out of Tyvek. It has this kind of bee logo on the back, and it has pollinator gloves. They're these kind of thick gloves that have long Q-tips that come off of them, so you can help the bees in the pollination process. And it has this multi-layered helmet. It's kind of a two-part helmet. The outside is kind of a plasticky film, and the inside is mesh. So that way you have a nice barrier away from the bees, but it's still creating a closed, or partially closed, intimate space. So you might also see in this like spinning image here, there's a funnel that comes off of the front, and that's what allows bees to come inside. And there are little holes in the top for air circulation and also for the bees to exit. So after making this suit, I decided it was time to just go and hang out with the bees and see what might I learn from sitting there and having a nice reflective moment with them. So I spent quite a few hours hanging out by the beehives. It got a little hot in there, so I added some extra ventilation holes. It was also better for the bees to be able to exit that way. But it was really kind of amazing. The bees would come in to they were attracted in through, you know, all of the flowers that were inside of the helmet. And the outer barrier, the vinyl, it helped to like heighten the sensory experience. So the buzzing of their wings was really loud. The scent of the flowers and the honey was amplified, and it was kind of warm, and it sort of became this meditative, just intimate space for reflection. So again, very analog, nothing too technically savvy here, but just a space to kind of create a connection, or maybe to give you some time to reflect on a connection that is always there. So another piece I want to talk about is Zea corvus homo, which is an example of a work that brings together multiple species. So in this case, it's humans, corn, and birds. So corvus is the genus for crows. Turns out that more than crows came to join us, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So this was actually made at another residency program by the Holes in the Wall Collective. It was based out in Pennsylvania in this rural retired cornfield, which was sort of an amazing place to go and visit. So I was invited to just live and work in the field for a couple of weeks, and our only instruction was make something that is sort of related to the cornfield. So thinking about monocrop culture, the field had been used to make corn year after year. I kind of just wanted to know, like, what does that do to the soil? So I started by taking soil samples from all over the field, and I was testing them and found that there were varying levels of phosphorus and potassium, but the nitrogen level across the board was extremely low, which is a very common outcome of monocrop culture. So my next thinking was, how do I maybe activate a system to help to restore some of this nitrogen to the land? You know, the humans and the corn are responsible for like taking it out. How can we maybe help bring it back in? So it turns out that in some very quick preliminary research, it was a very short residency, one rich source of nitrogen is bird poop. So I started building bird feeders to just encourage birds to come out, to perch, to eat, and to poop into the land. So since since humans had some responsibility in having the planting the corn and having the nitrogen leave the field, I wanted them to have a role as well in helping to fix it. So humans had to refill the feeders on a daily basis or weekly basis, depending on how many birds came to visit. And the feeders themselves were loosely related to the structure of corn stalks. So you'll see it's about the same height as a full-grown corn stalk, and there's this tassel on the top that sort of references the tassel that is usually used to pollinate the corn kernels. But in this case, it was made out of fiber optics, and then there was a single LED beneath it, which was actually being powered by the soil just below it. You can see on this image here, there are a couple of cups that are sunk in the ground. They're filled with mud and just an anode and cathode, and they're all attached and strung up to basically power the LED for the couple of weeks that I was there. And luckily it worked. Over on the right, you can see this image of not a crow necessarily, but a blue jay that came to perch and eat and poop with us. And we had quite a few different varieties of birds that came out, and it was fun to not only watch them, but also be part of the process of refilling it and kind of just seeing how it progressed over time. So the last thing to note about this piece is that there were 7 feeders in total, and they were placed in the field to mirror the Seven Sisters constellation. And so I chose this specific constellation because it was supposedly used by North American agricultural communities as an indicator of when to start planting and when to harvest. So when it shows up in the sky, it's a time to like plant your corn, and when it stops showing up in the sky, it's time to harvest the corn. So it felt like an appropriate kind of mirroring message to illuminate in the night sky. So as in the daytime, this is a very small picture here, but you could kind of wander through the field coming across these feeders every now and then, and at nighttime it was very dark. I'm used to New York City. Rural Pennsylvania is very, very dark. And it was really nice to kind of have these like very dimly glowing stars that were kind of illuminated throughout the field. So the last previous work that I'm going to talk about today is Homo plus Homo 2. Which kind of looks inward toward the human. I wanted to sort of rethink what it meant to be human. And by that, I mean looking at bacteria. So we have bacteria all over and inside of us, trillions and trillions of them. And I know that like during a pandemic, thinking about bacteria and viruses is something that is a little bit alarming, perhaps. It's all about being clean and wearing masks and washing your hands and not sneezing. But many of these microorganisms that live in and on us are extremely safe and also beneficial to our living beings. And some research came out a few years, probably more than that ago now, that was linking the bacteria in our gut flora, directly to our brain activity. So this was sort of a very exciting discovery. It wasn't just affecting our moods necessarily, but depending on the types of bacteria that you had, the community, as well as their activity, it was actually affecting the parts of your brain that deal with like perception and memory and cognition, which I feel like are very essential to how I think about me as a human, me as a person. So it kind of reframed how I was thinking about me. Instead of it being like an I was a little bit more of a we. And that was this kind of community way of thinking about like my body and me as a being was I don't know, it was exciting to me, and I wanted to start thinking about how I could start eating not only for like myself, but also for all of the creatures that help to make me work and make me who I am. So I created this piece to connect the act of eating, since it turns out that our gut flora get food in the same way that we feed ourselves. It's through eating. So it's connecting eating with bacterial growth. So here you'll see there's a candy dispenser on the left photo. And it has, this was a piece that was actually set up at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn. It was during a an event, a music event was happening, so a lot of people were kind of moving through the space at various times. But basically what you do is you could put in a quarter to choose a candy, and it was either flavored with garlic, leek, or onion and kale. And I chose these flavors. I made homemade candy by dehydrating these vegetables and like turning it into powder and mixing it into candy. I chose those because they're really rich in this fiber called inulin, which happens to be the food that our gut flora like to eat. So yes, so the candy dispenser was also rigged up to act as switches. So depending on which candy flavor you chose, it activated a different effect or environmental condition inside of this other growth chamber that was living nearby. So let's say if you chose the leek flavor, it might turn on the UV light. If you chose the garlic flavor, it might turn on the heat lamp. The other one might turn on the humidifier. So I just wanted to directly link the idea of eating, like choosing foods that you eat and the bacterial growth that happens. So basically, depending on whichever flavors were most popular that night or that the visitors were choosing, it either helped or hindered the growth of this kind of bacteria culture that was growing on the petri dish inside of this chamber. Side note, it was also really fun to see how garlic candy affected the people in the space, in this really crowded space. It turns out I made them a little too strong. So there was a lot of like leaning back when people were talking to one another. It was a fun emergent property. And that said, I was able to kind of tweak the recipe a little bit. And for the next time that I showed the piece, it was at an outdoor festival in New York, in Wassaic, New York. Slightly less garlicky, slightly less oniony, and it was outdoors, so I built this tent structure to go around it. And this one was located on the grounds sort of in between the art installations and the food tents, which felt like a very appropriate place for this conversation to happen. And that brings us to Cornerstone. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what I've been working on in my time here. It's been a great journey. I've been able to try a lot of kind of experiments and prototypes to try to like use the space just to play around with some of these ideas. If you haven't yet been to the studios, I highly recommend keeping an eye open for the next Open Studios event. The spaces are absolutely beautiful. There's tons of natural light. And I love how every artist's space feels a little bit different or a lot of bit different. Some are like really nice and orderly and neat. Some are like cozy and warm. And then mine here, as you can see, kind of leans into like the disheveled and chaotic vibe, but that seems to work for me. So yeah, it's been an absolute delight working here in this space. One of my absolute favorite parts of having a studio space is having big blank walls to fill up. I do like to keep ideas in sketchbooks, but I think when I'm actually in the process of making, I really prefer that my thinking and my research and sketches are sort of out of my head, out of my notebook, and onto the wall so that they're visible. And that way, if I'm ever sort of stuck, it's kind of a good place just to like move my gaze and start like rethinking how to find my way, my next step. So yeah, so that brings us to the actual work. What have I been doing? So about the same time that I got the studio residency, I also got a small grant from this collective called the Ocean Memory Project. And it's this interdisciplinary collective made up of artists and scientists and thinkers who gather for workshops and things to kind of talk about ocean memory. What does that mean? How can we explore that? How might it help us better understand the ocean? So my particular grant was a collaboration with 3 others, Dominic Civitilli, Tim Weaver, and Stephen Fior. And we each had separate goals within the grant with sort of mini projects. And then we would just kind of come together virtually to discuss how our progress was going, to share information. And the goal was that that information informed all of our individual work. So Dominic was a PhD student, and he was studying octopuses, specifically the function and cognition in their arms. And so in light of his research, we all kind of dove in and started making our own work about octopuses. Now, I knew basically nothing about the octopus, which is always a fun place to start. So I just kind of started broad and was learning as much as I could about our, ocean-dwelling sisters. And one of the original things that kind of caught my attention is this idea of kind of the evolutionary tract that we were on. So our last common ancestor with the octopus was 600 million years ago. And then we, diverged. We went separate ways. The cephalopods kind of showed up, and then much later, humans finally showed up. And it's sort of amazing that, of course, there are tons of differences between humans and octopuses, but at the same time, there are some similarities too. There's like curiosity and play and intelligence, and I think that thinking about like the evolutionary path was, while kind of highlighting how different we were, it felt like a good place to kind of have some compelling thinking around how might we be interconnected? How might we relate to this creature? So another part of the octopus that I really kind of dove into was learning about their skin. Their skin is amazing. It is like chameleons changing color has nothing on the octopus. They have multi-layered skin. It's attached to their nervous system, so it can change in like fractions of a second. Scientists think that it's used, of course, for camouflage and also communication, but they've also observed octopuses in captivity like changing their skin color while sleeping, which also brings another compelling question, like what does an octopus dream about? And yeah, so here on the left is a close-up of octopus skin. You can see these like different circles are actually different sacs of colored pigment. They can expand and contract to change the overall color. And then on the right is just a very beautiful octopus. It's called the blue ringed octopus, and it has these like very gorgeous patterns that it can make with its amazing skin. So part of the way they do that is they have these multiple layers. There's the top layer, which is really, it's kind of a muscular layer that's still translucent, and that's how it changes like texture and shape. It isn't just the color that changes. Below that are the chromatophores, which again are those sac-like structures I was talking about. They're typically red, black, and yellow, and so they can kind of constrict and expand to make the overall creature have patterns or change color, kind of like pixels in a way. And then below that are the iridophores and leucophores, and those are very reflective, just very reflective layers, and they kind of bounce back blue ambient light or white light, and that's what causes that kind of glowing look that you can sometimes see in their skin. So just trying to figure out how these crazy creatures are, I wanted to embark on quite a few experiments to try to become more like the octopus. The original plan of the grant was to go out to Washington to meet up with Dominic at his lab with our other group members and to actually hang out with a bunch of octopuses, but alas, COVID kind of made that impossible, so I decided to use the time to kind of have solitary thinking, which sort of makes sense because most octopuses are solitary creatures. And I wanted to instead try to see how I could make myself become more like an octopus, and what might I learn from that. So here is I was talking about octopus skin. Theirs is so highly active and responsive, but here is a very passive version of trying to understand maybe how their skin works. So I made various costumes and suits that kind of mimic the different layers. One on the left here is just this tulle cape thing that kind of adds some texture and it refracts some light. In the middle is just a gray leotard that has color on it that's starting to mimic the patterns of the projection. That's, in this case, it's kind of a watery projection on me. And then the last one is made out of just really reflective, like athletic material, kind of thinking about those leucophores and iridophores. How can I be as reflective as possible, bouncing back that ambient light? So yeah, so I was kind of taking these pictures, trying out different types of projections onto it. I should also note that part of my grant was to create, to do a lot of these experiments, document them, and then to create a book of just kind of having it as a record of all of these activities. And so in this case, all of the pages, I have a proof here. It's printing, it should be finished soon, but you can take a look at this after. But all of these images are actually printed on a translucent kind of vellum paper. So when they stack up, it's starting to cause a little bit more of that like kind of see-through, multi-layered skin effect that I was hoping for. But anyway, here it is with a different kind of background, a more colorful underwater scene. And lastly, here is a very clean-cut checkered pattern. So as you can see, some of the suits work better than others for camouflaging, and a lot of it also depends on the different type of scenario that our projected image. Yeah, so some variation. Definitely not as good as the octopus itself. So another experiment that I was trying to become more like an octopus was by building a light-sensing skin suit. So octopuses actually have opsin molecules in their skin, so they can see light or detect light without having to use their eyes. So this is the suit here. You can also see it up here. This is like a very early version, a drawing of it, trying to like figure out what this thing is. And basically it has photoresistors that are embedded in this like neoprene fabric every so often, kind of down these arms, on the hands, the front and the back, and also on the knees. And as those, so if you put on the suit, basically the light sensors pick up the light information, and that is sent to these tiny computers that are sitting on the shoulders. And that leads to the goggles, where it activates the, it starts to show the light inside of the goggle. I'm not explaining this well, but basically each sensor is attached to a different LED, and they're kind of organized on spatially, like the left arm is located on the left side of the goggles. So when you're wearing this, you can't actually see anything other than the light coming from the LEDs, which are actually reading the sensors that are on your arms and knees. Also, a shout out to my partner here. Thank you for being my tech expert and helping to like code and troubleshoot this thing. He is a great collaborator if anyone is open to incorporating some tech into their work. So yeah, so this is what the prototype looked like in use or on me. Next step was to see what it could do. What can I see? So again, in the studio, sorry, this is a bit of a dark slide here, but I wanted to start with a very simple form. Like in a totally dark room, if I'm wearing this suit with goggles on my eyes so I can't see anything but what the LEDs are showing me, can I even identify a spotlight? So it turns out I could, and it was interesting because you could sort of start to see if when one hand was in the light versus the other, so it was getting a little bit of spatial orientation. But then it was time to kind of up the complexity a little bit. So I tried a pattern that was more like kind of a target symbol, concentric circles, again, trying to like establish if I could understand where one bit of light would end and where the next would begin. Also led to looking into just bars or stripes of light, like is that easier to understand than round shapes? And lastly, our good old checkerboard pattern. And I was noticing that obviously, I mean, maybe this isn't that surprising, but simple shapes were pretty easy to detect. But the more complex the pattern and shape, the less able I was to understand the exact, kind of the exact pattern. But I should also add a little bit of context here. The reason I was choosing these shapes, this checkerboard that kind of comes up again and again, and these stripes, is actually drawing from some of the cephalopod research where scientists have put cephalopods in these different, these are cuttlefish. They've put them in these different scenarios to try to see how well they could camouflage in them to varying degrees of success, depending on the scale of the size. And I don't know, there's some pretty impressive displays going on there. This is one of my particular favorites. It was a BBC documentary where they put this cuttlefish in this living room scenario. So there's this cute little couch and the checker floor and these striped walls. And it's just kind of encouraged to float around and try to blend into whatever it can. Why, I'm not entirely sure, but I felt like it was this kind of fun connection to a cuttlefish in a very human feeling scenario. So my next step on this prototype is to make it to where it's something that I can share with others. I would love other people to be able to experience it and try it on. So that might include simplifying it a little bit to where it isn't molded to my height and the size of my arms, and instead is something that's a little bit easier to clip on, not quite so fragile. And I'd also like to increase the sensitivity. So adding more sensors, changing how the display and the goggles works, and of course, making it battery powered so you don't have to drag an extension cord around with you. But again, a lot of the work done here, it was a great time to just experiment and kind of build a lot of different prototypes, and I'm excited to see where they go next. So the next thing I'll show you is related to how octopus arms work. So octopuses have 9 brains. There's a central brain that sits actually surrounding their esophagus. So it's very important that they chew their food very well. So there's this main donut brain, and then there are neuron clusters or small brains in each of the individual arms. And all of them are interconnected, so they do work together, but an arm can sort of it can have its own action. It can be a little bit autonomous. So they've even found that if it's the arm is totally severed, it can still move and explore and react to light or other stimuli for about an hour, which is kind of amazing. And an octopus can regrow a severed limb entirely from scratch, which is also amazing, something I wish we could do. But yeah, so I was thinking about what does that mean if your arm, if your limbs had their own brains, and how might I explore that a little bit? So I built a big kaleidoscope out of mylar, different mylar panels in the studio with this opening that I could fit my arm through. And so I set up a camera to where it was recording my arm's motion and the reflections. There was a little bit of cyan lighting, but it was kind of creating this watery scape, and the reflections weren't, since it was this kaleidoscope element, the reflections were kind of responding in surprising ways sometimes. So here I took those images and I kind of cut them up and I collaged them into this longer piece where all of the 8 arms are essentially doing their own thing. Here's another version of it. In the book, I'm often incorporating some of my thinking and questions into the imagery. So here it's just kind of posing this question: imagine your limbs each with separate minds that can work together or independently. What happens when they disagree? So this is kind of the style of the book if you want to take a look. And one other one. And yeah, so I guess what's next is I want to continue working on this stuff. You may have noticed that there were no live octopuses in this work. That is also something that is, I think, pretty core to my making. It needs to bring, in my mind, the non-human and the human together. So I'm excited to, having spent this time kind of gaining empathy for these creatures, I'm excited to start working with them. So I'm currently trying to find a lab or aquarium or someone who has an octopus who will allow me to come in and sort of experiment non-invasively with their creatures. If you know of anyone, let me know. And yeah, otherwise I've just applied to a new grant, actually again with the Ocean Memory Project. It's with a new group of people, and we're focusing directly on senses and ocean memory, which is a really exciting kind of segue that kind of out of this work sort of leads nicely into. There are a few other things in the works. I would love to, please take my information. I would love to keep in touch with anyone. You can follow along on my website or Instagram, but otherwise I will pause there for any questions you might have. Oh, wow, yeah, amazing.
So I find it interesting that you're trying to figure out the way different species interface and interact. And the thing is, nature already has its own ways of doing that automatically. So to what extent is your work about trying to insert yourself into the natural process and understand the intentions of nature and the mind of nature in some way?
I think that's an excellent question, and it kind of gets to the root of some of the philosophy that's at the heart of this work. So, reading a lot of process philosophy, or Bruno Latour or whatever, who claims that we have never been modern. That's a really interesting idea. What is the difference between nature and other, and is there any such thing as non-nature? And so I'm more in the camp of thinking that our new reality, despite the fact that humans have adapted it and changed it, is not really any less natural than it was before, because humans are natural, right? It has its problems, sure. That doesn't give us a free rein to do whatever we want. But I think that's, it's just a shift in thinking. Rather than thinking of the human as other than the nature, I kind of want to make sure that we're encompassing it all into the same conversation. And so I'm trying to do that in different ways. Sometimes that is just illuminating, like you said, interactions between different organisms that already are happening. And other times it's maybe trying to build totally new environments that a human and non-human wouldn't necessarily have been in naturally or however else, and to see kind of what emerges from that.
And the scope of the conversation can be larger than we can imagine.
Totally, that's a great question, thank you.
There is. What activates the sensors on that? And the other part of it is you recorded the visual of it. I assume that was just from your memory of what you saw with the goggles on?
Yeah, those are great questions too. I love talking about how things work. So these are photoresistors, and depending on the amount of light that hits this sensor, it changes the amount of resistance that this little piece of hardware passes along. So basically, it's one way to detect if a light source is high or low, depending on how much resistance it's creating. And so this is it is powered, but it's really the Arduino, the processor up here, that's holding the power, and that's receiving the input from this photo processor. So that said, there are more advanced photo sensors that I would like to explore, some that aren't necessarily quite so passive, but might be able to give a little more data than just like a resistance shift. But yeah, so this is what's doing the work, and then the output is assigned to different LEDs that are in this, these strip LEDs lining the goggles, kind of like a matrix. And you're right that it was my memory of talking about how the goggles felt when they were on. In a perfect world, this is something that you can just try on and explore and figure it out for yourself. But also I did set up the scenarios where I had the goggles out, and a camera was on the goggles documenting, and I was kind of moving the arms and things around into different light conditions. So that was documented in the book, where you're able to sort of see the readout inside of the goggles related to the light conditions that the thing was in. So just to help to give a reader, for example, maybe a little bit better of an understanding of what it might actually be like to have the goggles and the suit on. But again, post-COVID, when this is not really such a fragile prototype, the goal is to have an experience that others can share, and it's not just something that I've experienced and I'm telling you about.
It would be interesting to see what happens if you try to draw all the goggles are on and see what your perception is going to your hand.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that what's so nice about being able to have the space to experiment is you find out such interesting questions and new things to start trying out. And I do think this is just the beginning of a suit. It's I feel like there's a lot to like learn from how it's responding, and also are there, you know, other more compelling like ways for it to work? Definitely.
I'm just wondering, were there any stories from childhood which influenced your thinking or in your life? You know, I'm thinking of Dr. Dolittle, of course. Any of these, for me, it was Harold and Purple Crayon. Any stories that are foundational to your thinking later as an adult? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I don't know if I've connected it back to my childhood directly yet. It's like, do I have to work with my therapist on that? Yeah, I think, you know, I always loved books with animals in them, of course. I think that's not a very uncommon trait, but yeah, I don't know. I'm curious. It's interesting because I feel like so many books like anthropomorphize animals in a way, and that's partly what I'm kind of pushing against. Like, rather than having everything turn into like a version of a human, I'm trying to like even out the playing field where we're all just what we are, or even like the human trying to be more like another creature. I mean, I grew up in South Louisiana, so we like hung outside a lot. There was a lot of like playing in mud and finding crawfish in the gutters and whatever else. So a lot of like interspecies interactions that way. I think I ate a dead mole at one time. My mother found me. Maybe that's not a story for today. So yeah, so lots of creatures. I think I was always attracted to like animals and life and things, but I don't know if there's a direct story. I'll have to think about that a little more. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about yourself as a student, as somebody on a learning process, on a learning journey, as well as on a creative journey. Can you talk a little about your place between learning and creation, your journey?
Yeah. I actually kind of consider those the same thing. I think my art practice is, it's rooted, or it comes from a place of curiosity and also like learning from others. So it is collaborative. I do often reach out to other people who know, facts that I might not know, or information that I might not know, whether that's a scientist or someone who's like intimately involved with a non-species that I'm interested in working with. And that's part of what I think keeps me excited about the work, is that I am always learning. And I'm hoping at the same time though, that like the creative lens of making things also is beneficial for the other party too, that it's not just a one-way street of I'm like consuming their knowledge, but instead that there's like a dialogue that's happening that that's hopefully interesting and mind expanding or world expanding. Yeah.
Okay, my question is similar to the gentleman here. It's more like if you can give us a specific lesson that you learned from interacting either with the bees or the octopus, because most of the time we have some characteristic that we learn from them or become wiser maybe. So can you give us just one example that was profound for you?
Yeah, I feel like there have been many profound moments. I think one thing that I'm always kind of finding out is that it's really hard to overcome a like bias or a kind of ideology that's sort of baked in. So I'm always sort of fighting against this idea of like human-centric thinking. That's something that like in our Western culture, the way that science is kind of taught in schools, that's it's like always kind of seeping in, and I feel like that's something I'm always humbled by working with other creatures and trying to like remind myself to like go back to like thinking about this from a flattened hierarchy. But I think what I like the most is that when I actually have other living things in the work, I never really know what the final outcome will be. Something surprising usually happens, whether it's like building giant ant farms and the ants like always find a way to escape somehow. It's like doesn't matter how careful you are, or even just kind of setting up like trading scenarios for people to kind of take a piece of moss or a plant or something and leave something behind. I think the dialogue that comes out of it is what's most compelling to me and usually leads to like the next work. But yeah, I think learning a lot about the ecology and world around us also helps me to be just a more empathetic person. And that's something that I find really useful in day to day. Yeah. Yeah, let's go Nicholas and then you, yeah.
For the suit itself, when you said when it went into the light, there was like resistance for the actual suit. When there's like, are the electromagnetic waves, like, are they turning like motors that like make the suit like a lot more tight, or is it like, what is the feeling?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that's, I think a great next step would be to add like a touch sensory experience inside. By resistance, I was meaning the amount of electrical current that's actually moving through this sensor. So it isn't something I could feel on my skin, but so it kind of like, I don't know, I love that idea though, like if it is something that like warms or you can feel like a vibration or something too, like an extra way to identify which limb is in the like illuminated area versus a dark area. And I think bringing in more sensory experiences would be another way to kind of lean a little bit more into becoming more like an octopus. Yeah, good question. Hi.
This is fascinating, and I've been upstairs and I've seen some of the work by the artists that are traditionally here, and they tend to be, even in the sculptural elements, more traditional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional representations, ideas. And I liked very much the images of the mylar where your arm is coming through, almost as an aesthetic creation. But I'm wondering what is the end result of the art, quote unquote, here? Is it the suit? Is it the experience? Is it the book? Yeah. Is it a package deal where you are saying to the world, everything I'm learning and everything I'm experiencing, I'd like to share in a way? I mean, at one point I was like, could you build something so sophisticated that you could go swim with an octopus and sort of communicate via skin changes with it?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it's one that I wrestle with all the time. In my mind, the work is the experience. Not only like my experience, but ideally the experience of of other people, of the other species, kind of the interactions that are ongoing and the work unfolding. That said, though, that's a very kind of abstract notion of a thing, right? So it makes it hard to, it sometimes makes it challenging to kind of quantify like what the art is. So I'm trying all sorts of different things. So sometimes I try video where you can actually like see the process unfolding in real time. I'm trying things like books to kind of document the process. Also, yeah, like it was a great point to notice like those collages are kind of like a two-dimensional thing. It is actually like printed out large scale in my studio. That's more of a traditional like two-dimensional thing you can like hang over your couch or something. But I think the like medium itself is trying to, I just want it to kind of relate to this being a process. And I think that that's important to my thinking about the work, that it's unfolding, it's systems-based, it's being changed by the person that's interacting with it and the non-human that's interacting with it and all of the non-living things that are in the space as well. So it's kind of this phenomenological event that's unfolding. But documenting that is a ongoing challenge for sure, yeah. And I would love to be able to like get this suit to where I could go underwater and and see like already sensing the world underwater is something that's kind of opaque to me. So adding a different element to that or a new way of using my own senses would be an excellent idea. So maybe that's another next step. All right, great.
If there's no more questions, we just want to thank Dana for sharing her work with us.
thank you all so much for coming and such great questions. Yeah, this was a wonderful conversation.